Well, it's already 3, so we're going to start. Well, on behalf of the Lewis Stokes Midwest Regional Center of Excellence, we welcome you to today's session titled Data Science for Pacific Impact, Innovating Digital Research Opportunities to Prepare Pacific STEM Change Agents. Now, my name is Paula Maria Ortiz Gonzalez, and I will serve as this session's moderator. I am pleased to be here today as I'm connected to the LSM program as an alumni. This is my 2nd year, and it's been an amazing experience thus far. So before I introduce today's speaker, I need to provide some general housekeeping items. Now, first, you'll notice that the session is being recorded. So it will be made available for viewing through the Whova app by next Wednesday. Also, we're going to ask you to please provide your feedback about today's session in a post-session survey that when the session is over, I will link down in the chat below. If you have any questions for the presenter, once she finishes the presentation, well, then you guys can go through the Whova Q&A or the Whova chat, and we'll be moderating those questions for her to answer. Also, this session, I would like to say that it's scheduled to take 45 minutes approximately, so it is imperative that we stay within the time. And feel free that if we run out of the Q&A session, we encourage you to use also the Whova discussion board. So if by any chance we can't have any more time for questions, please feel free to go over there, and Dr. Helen will also be available through her email to answer any more questions that you guys might have. So without any further ado, I'll present today's speaker, which is Dr. Helen Turner.
Hopefully a hotel room in Portland, Oregon, and I have blurred out my background so that none of you have to experience the really bad art that's behind me. So my talk today is Data Science for Pacific Impact, and I'm going to talk about digital research opportunities that we've been designing, implementing, evaluating in the Pacific to really think about how data science can contribute to preparing a new generation of change agents, mitigate many of the challenges and opportunities that the Pacific region offers. I am presenting the work of many today. I'm honored to be representing a team that comprises a large number of faculty and staff across many different Pacific locales. And this is just a list of the primary people who are really responsible for all of the good work that I'm going to be presenting today. This is the standard disclaimer for the National Science Foundation. These views are my own and the co-authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the NSF. So today's session, I want to hit 5 major topics. The first is really a primer on the Pacific that addresses this idea that the Pacific contains these iconic paradise locations that are all familiar parts of our Western imagination, but there are paradoxes, there are dualities that challenge the Pacific to really thriving in a modern globalized economy. These are also islands of opportunity, and this is the name of our LSMRCE Alliance here in Hawaii that has run for over 15 years now and incorporates partnership, authentic partnership with islands across the science. Data science relates to the Pacific past, to its present, and to its future. I'm going to present our community-engaged computing model that we developed first at Chaminade, and now we've been disseminating and working with partners across the US mainland and across the Pacific Islands, and developing this out into formal and informal learning pathways. Specifically, I'm going to talk about 2 programs, Data Skills and SPICE, both NSF-funded programs, how they've innovated in this space and how the outcomes are turning out, and talk about some lessons learned. We'll have some time for some discussion, and then I'm going to finish with a challenge to our whole hui that you're now part of, our family, which is that how can you partner with us going forward? So I think this is the iconography of beautiful in city under a vast sky. And I wanted to give more context about what do we really talk about when we are talking about the Pacific. So Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific is one US state due to frictions that were joined within a compact of free association with the United States after World War II. It covers around 2 million square miles. 2 million inhabitants are distributed across around 2,100 major islands.
It looks like Helen has unfortunately lost her internet connection at the moment. Hopefully,
Oh, she's right here.
is
right
she still here?
Yeah, she just came back. Dr.
Oh,
Helen,
perfect.
You're on mute. And I think that what happened is that your Wi-Fi connection is a little bit weak.
Okay, all right. I'm going to write to the Marriott people about that. When did you lose me?
Well, I was wondering, were you presenting?
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to start again. It's all good. We have time.
No,
Okay.
yes, we do. We do, but we couldn't see your screen. So
Okay. See it now.
If we see it now, at least I don't. Does anybody else see the screen share?
No, let's go back.
I do not.
Just go and do your share screen like you practiced right before we started.
Will do. Okay, so I'm sharing.
Mhm.
There you go. Now start sharing. Now we can see it. All right.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. I'm just going to start again. Sorry.
That's perfect. It looks much better, and your connection even looks better on the image.
All right. So welcome to, this isn't a Pacific problem. I'm in Oregon right now, so we can't blame that. But so today I'm going to talk about data science, specific impact, and some digital research opportunities that we've been innovating in our LSMRCE Alliance here in the Pacific, with really a goal of utilizing data science to prepare the next generation of Pacific leaders and change agents to mitigate some of the challenges that we see in the Pacific Islands. And I'm going to present on the work of many. There is a huge team of faculty and staff who have contributed to this program. This is the core group of people whose work I'm really honored to represent today. This is the NSF disclaimer. So the architecture of today's session is I'm going to talk a little bit about our context here in the Pacific, why some of these locations are really paradoxical paradises, right? That I'm going to talk about the iconography that's in the Western imagination about the Pacific and some of the challenges that are in fact faced by the Pacific, especially in the light of climate change. And then also why these islands are islands of opportunity. This is the name of our LSMRCE Alliance, and it really speaks to the idea that the Pacific has a great deal to offer the world. I'm going to talk about data science in the Pacific past, present, and future, a community-engaged computing model that we have developed initially at Chaminade University, but now is propagated to the US mainland, to the Pacific Islands, and offers formal and informal learning pathways for upskilling in data science. I'm going to talk specifically about two programs, Data Skills and SPICE, what we've done, what we've learned, and then hopefully we'll have some discussion as well. So I think this is the iconography that most people see when they think about the Pacific Islands in their mind's eyes. When we talk about the Pacific, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about Hawaii and the US affiliated Pacific Islands. This is a state, two territories, and a number of freely associated states that were allied with the US through a compact of free association after the Second World War. It's 2 million square miles, 2,100 major islands and atolls house 2 million inhabitants. And when I say major, just to give you an idea, in the state of Chuuk, which is around here, 200 islands, the largest of which is 8 miles long. And almost all of these places are designated as United Nations Small Island Developing Economies. There are paradoxes and dualities with this idea of the idealized kind of iconography of the Pacific. The Pacific nations, most of them exist in a state of poverty. They have very low GDPs and massive unemployment. There are health inequities. So metabolic syndrome in the Pacific Islands, highest rates in the world. Native Hawaiian men are over incarcerated at the highest rate in the United States. And the populations of these islands have been subject to historical exploitation going back hundreds of years. Some contemporary examples of that, just as an example, the male population of Yap, 9,000 people total, is the most overrepresented in the US military per capita, and those men and women have no pathway to citizenship. Micronesian women are some of the most trafficked on Earth. And this whole 2 million square mile region for hundreds of years has been a pawn pivoting between the geopolitical tensions between superpowers, most recently between America and China. There is massive dependence on aid, which comes with the price tag of a healthy dose of neocolonialism in the Pacific. Food is insecure here, largely because of overfishing by external powers, pollution, and a nuclear aftermath as well. These are one of the few populations on Earth that actually are living with the generational effects of forced relocation due to nuclear testing and the health effects of exposure to radiation. There's massive depopulation, migration, including climate migrants in the Pacific Islands. And these are islands that are immediately today having to make choices about staying where they are or relocating due to seawater inundation and other effects of climate change. And there are differences. And I just want to emphasize this. This is mainly, I think, for the benefit of any NSF program officers who watch this presentation later, but there are differences to doing this work here in the Pacific. There's the cost of travel. There's the 6 to 14-hour time differences. So when this session started today, 10 a.m. Saturday Eastern time, that's 1 o'clock in the morning on Sunday for a participant in Ponape. So when an NSF reviewer tells me, why would we duplicate this program in the Pacific when you can get the same thing at Johns Hopkins, then this is the answer to that. And the other thing is that 25% of the world's 6,000 languages are Pacific languages. We are working with populations whose first, second, and sometimes third language might not be English. The opportunities, though, of working in this Pacific context, obviously for those who are Indigenous Pacific, it's not really an option, that this is who they are and where they are. But there is tremendous contemporary and historical Indigenous knowledge that can benefit from a global audience. These societies have developed globally relevant models for working in constrained resource situations. Their biodiversity and their earth and ocean systems are globally influential. They're a reservoir of completely unique cultures and epistemologies. And, from perhaps a more Western lens, they are a gateway between East and West, and there are vast economic exclusion zones associated with these islands. So why are they not in positions of more power on the global stage is an interesting question. So I want to contextualize our thinking about data science and how we're thinking about that in the Pacific past, in the present, and in the future. And we're lucky to have on our LSMRCE team Marata Tamira, who is an expert in art and iconography of Pacific Island nations. And so she really has got me thinking about this idea that we can parallel the way that the Pacific Islands have been perceived by the West in the way that they are interacted with scientifically in the West. So how does art parallel science? And so if you think about this sort of continuum of relationship between the West and the Pacific, for many, many years, artistically, it's been about depiction, documentation, being monitored, being studied. And what we're trying to do is figure out how can we assist and how can the Pacific become a group of nations that are studying themselves, monitoring themselves. And if you think about the iconography of the Pacific in art, it's gone from these ethnographic definitions, the documentation of the noble savages in Hawaii before they died out, Gauguin's Pacific muses, the mainstreaming through Disney. But we're seeing a transition now, to artists like Lisa Reinhardt from Aotearoa, this idea of reconstructing the Pacific narrative in art as something that is of the Pacific. Well, that's the kind of transition that we need to think about in science as well. We have this same transition from being a site to be monitored, a population to be studied, helicopter science, authentic and inauthentic partnering. I just got a message that the interaction is unstable. Can you still see me? Everyone's still there? Okay, good.
Yes.
And renaissances in understanding of the Pacific's own history of science and data, moving towards co-production, the Pacific as generative in data science and science in general, integrating other monitoring networks like the Earth observing system, but having agency, determination, sovereignty, and eventually economic and impact and power that derives from those, from that type of science, being inherently, of the Pacific and for the Pacific. So what we're really trying to position ourselves in the LSMRCE network and a bunch of other programs in the Pacific is how can we, foster and empower these types of traditions, just as we've seen in the world of art. How can we then, translate that into STEM? The optimism is that there are real economic and social possibilities for data science in the Pacific. And just to give you an idea, in Hawaii right now, we have been talking in our statewide science and tech plan, in our governor's post-COVID recovery plan, about this idea of the digital economy. Hawaii, because of its isolation, cost of import and export, almost impossible to establish a traditional tech sector here. But digitalization and the idea that we can build off of a core IT sector, develop a digital economy, and eventually become this kind of digitized economy where data science powers decision support and smartens all of our sectors. That's kind of the vision. And we're building workforce programs in cyber infrastructure and data science to meet those needs. In the Pacific, if we can solve problems around high-speed connectivity, with the advent of global working and remote working, and if we can solve local device access problems, then really there is, for the first time, a real possibility of building a tech economy in these remote locales, and the social possibilities of using data to empower the Pacific and to get agency and self-determination over the challenges that are faced. Those are also really huge. So really the central idea of what we're trying to do is realize these economic and social possibilities if we can build a skills base and the necessary infrastructure, and somehow we can collectively avoid a do-over of the exclusion and neocolonialism of STEM that has really been in the Pacific to date. So at Chaminade, when we started the Pacific's first data science major a few years ago, with the first incoming class in 2019, we developed a community engaged computing model. This was really centered on the idea that we can develop data science whose primary focus is on social change, social justice, and economic mobility. And we've developed formal and informal learning pathways, but they're all themed around this idea of a flow of data. And so Dr. Rylan Chong and his faculty team put students through a curriculum, which is a bona fide data science curriculum. They learn R, Python, machine learning, AI, strong focus on data ethics, but with this theme of community engaged computing, where data partners provide real world data sets and problems that the students wrangle through their coursework, through their project work, through their summer research experiences, and so on. And those data partners that we've really chosen to work with are nonprofits, community groups, grassroots, small business, Hawaiian serving organizations, groups that really need data to make a difference and deliver on their missions. Our analysts, our faculty, postdocs, and students who work together, who provide data products, visualizations for decision support that then are ported back out to those data partners and stakeholders. And this model has now really gone beyond the boundaries of our small institution, Chaminade, and even in Hawaii. So there's a whole ecosystem of programs, many of them NSF funded, that are using this model. It was inspired initially, to give credit where it's due, by the work of Kelly Gaither and Computing for Change, which she's from Texas Advanced Computing Center, and she really developed this idea of let's focus computing on social change and social mobility. And so our current status is that we have 3 types of program. We have the data science degree programs that are offered at Chaminade and Hilo on Hawaii Island, and the University of Hawaii and some of the community colleges are also starting to offer certificates and eventually majors in this area as well. This is a highly diverse group of students. 70% of them are female and Native Hawaiian. And of our first 9 graduates next year, 7 are going to be Native Hawaiian and 6 are Native Hawaiian women. And it's funded in part by NSF scholarship grants. Our SPICE 1-month summer immersions have been incredibly successful. We've offered those both on ground and online, and that stands for Supporting Pacific Indigenous Computational Excellence. And while our focus is on Indigenous representation from the Pacific in these programs, we're also really focusing on anyone who is marginalized and minoritized by those inequities that I talked about in the previous slide. And most recently, we've added this concept of a data skills program, which has been adopted by LSMRCE and a number of other environments. And through this, we put several hundred students now across many institutions. And this is really about reskilling and upskilling and getting ready for one of these data science pathways. This model has even been adopted by organizations who are looking to do organizational change for their employees around data science and data-driven decision support. So we're going to hear now from some members of our team who are just going to give their perspective as these experts and champions for data science in the Pacific.
Aloha, Hafide, and Kasalelia. My name is Johnny Tadela Aldan. I am a Pacific Healthcare Data Analyst with Chaminade University of Honolulu. With warming global temperatures and rising sea levels, climate change increasingly impacts the environmental, economic, and healthcare security in every Pacific Island community. As Pacific Island territories and nations wait for larger countries to commit full-scale shifts in the policies that curb carbon emissions, the Pacific region must continuously adapt, build, and improve on climate resiliency. Increasing Pacific data science capacity, especially throughout the United States-affiliated Pacific Islands, or US APIs, comprising of 6 jurisdictions that include US territories and freely associated Pacific nations, and home to nearly 2 million people spread across 2,000 individual islands over millions of square miles. Data science will serve as the bridge, better connecting us through shared issues with the advantage of mitigating existing problems together and better preparing for future climate-related issues. With more opportunities like early interest training and data science internships and early professional mentorship, these homegrown Pacific data scientists can shed greater light on local problems with improved skill sets and provide working solutions through new knowledge for Pacific leaders to make evidence-based decisions. Thank you.
Aloha, I am Dr. Rylan Chong, and I am a faculty in the data science program at Chaminade University of Honolulu. What community engaged computing means to me is working with a group from a community, nonprofit, grassroots, or an organization on a computing project or a project that utilizes computing resources or support. The key idea I want to emphasize about community engagement is based on 2 words, working with, in which the development, learning, and outcomes are shared experiences.
Kia ora koutou katoa, aloha. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, representing the Islands of Opportunity Alliance. The inaugural data camp that Chaminade University has established and that Iowa LSMRCE students have benefited from immensely marks a noteworthy accomplishment in our efforts to open up sustainable pathways that put data science in the hands of Indigenous Pacific people for Indigenous Pacific people. I want to suggest the idea that data science constitutes the new Pacific STEM frontier, if you like, that will not only put us on the leading edge of global STEM research engagement, but more importantly, it provides a crucial platform for the people of the Pacific to learn and then transform the science into a tool that can be used to empower and improve Pacific lives and communities across the region. This really is an exciting time of opening up STEM opportunities for the people of the Pacific. And IOA LSAMP is so honored to join Chaminade in this enriching
and as you can
collaborative
see, one of our
idea
other
campaign.
partners, Dr. Alex Stokes, hands down refused to record a video, but he heads up the justice-orientated approaches to data science program, JADE, which was recently funded by NSF and is a key part of what we're doing.
Aloha, Hafide, and
So,
Kasalelia.
what is the
Hello,
structure of
my
our
name is John.
program? When we started developing the idea of a program to build data skills in Pacific Island participants, one of the things that was kind of leveled at us, mainly at me, by review panels was, well, why do this? You're duplicating things that already exist. There are things called Data Camp and Udemy and these kind of online data skills programs. Why not just use them? And so we took a really careful look at that. And the pros of those kinds of organizations, if you take Data Camp, for example, hundreds of courses, thousands of modules, career tracks, almost endless resources, and online and self-paced and competency-based. But the downside is that they have, very dismal completion rates by their own assessment from their own websites. And they're very agnostic to context. And so what we felt was that we could leverage resources like Data Camp, Software Carpentry, Udemy, those kinds of online things, but really apply our own lens and really kind of level them up to make them relevant and successful in our student populations. So what our program structure is the first step in it is what we call the Data RX, a prescription where faculty work with a participant, a student or an employed person, to really develop this personalized pathway through these endless online resources. Figuring out where students are starting, where they need to go, how can we have a tailored pathway that is a sense making of this huge online universe of data science training opportunities. The students go through this program, they skill up, do the self-paced competency-based skills building through these modules, and these are curated with faculty technical assistance to get students over the hump and overcome these very low completion rates that all of us kind of think experience every time we download some app that we never quite finish using. The students and participants then apply their learning to a mini research project that applies their skills to a problem that is of relevance to them, their sociocultural context, or their employer. They reflect, self-assess, iterate this whole process, and eventually become part of a community of practice that we're forming for Pacific data science. And what we've noticed is that we can do variations on a theme, right? The upskilling on-ramp through the online modules and the application project of components of every scenario that we've developed this program for. But we've done this as equally spaced. We've done it as where you upskill, you do the project, then you upskill again. We've had short and long on-ramps. We've had employed professionals who preferred to do the modules and the projects entirely in parallel. And we have had participants who've kind of oscillated between doing the upskilling and then just in time upskilling as problems arise in their project. And overall, we're now looking at several thousand module hours, 200 participants across 12 colleges, 1 REU, 3 workplaces. Our completion rate is 96%. 90% of our participants are not computational majors, almost 80% are women and 90% of them are Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. So we really feel we built a better mousetrap. We took what was out there, but we've developed it in a way that is appropriate to us. And that's because we espouse a number of operating principles that have been generated over the last 5 to 10 years, really, from programs like our Howard Hughes Inclusive Excellence, on it, NSF includes funding, and the new work that Alex Stokes is doing in JADE. And it's really this idea that we're going to, for these formal and informal learning pathways, we're going to have no code and low code entry points, and we're going to be friendly to non-computational majors, that they are going to be culturally sustaining. They're going to incorporate protocol, opportunities to demonstrate learning to community and family, and that everything about them is going to be relationship-based, including the layered mentoring that we offer. We believe, as a held principle, that if students are presented and given the opportunity to do relevant projects that are justice oriented and relevant to their sociocultural context, that is going to decrease their outsider status, increase their sense of belonging and sense of purpose in STEM. We've tried to make these programs longitudinal and link them out to a matrix of opportunities. So we have students who are going from our program into majors across the Pacific. We have students who are going from our program to REUs on the mainland, and so on. And we are really, committed to the idea that these programs need to be inclusive. And the way we define that is that they are feminist, they are counter stereotypical in terms of their role models, they offer counter storytelling. We're very keen on the idea of what they call the hegemony treasure hunt, right? Looking for biases and looking for systemic inequities in data as part of the research process. And these programs are built to be scalable and broadly adaptable to minoritized and marginalized communities outside the Pacific region. So what these programs look like, boots on the ground, what's a day in the life of someone who is a participant in our data skills HUI for IOA, the LSMRCE Alliance. They're set weekly goals. They start by getting this prescription of a data skills building module core, plus any particular areas that we feel that their projects are going to demand. They go through ideation, a literature review, a search for data. Rylan Chong invented the idea of students bidding their project for a kind of real world experience and to get some peer review of them early on. They do analysis and then they present. And we have weekly check-ins, there's peer mentoring on demand, there's weekly professional development programming, and the whole thing ends in a hoiki, a video showcase. For SPICE, which is our summer immersion program, very similar idea, a lot of emphasis there on, because we have an extended time frame, the idea of being able to do cultural programming in addition to professional development program. And the Rylan keeps them on a tight schedule of daily homeworks, and we try to make sure that these are employer-ready skills that we can document for the students in things like a Jupyter notebook or a GitHub portfolio. We have formal evaluation, which is done for our SPICE program by Lisanne Stefano at Georgia Institute of Technology. We also run basically skills assessment. So we're very interested in asking the question, how do our students' skills base increase across the program? How does that line up with what the Association for Computing Machinery says are data science competencies? How does it line up with what Excel, advanced Excel benchmarks are? And so we do this kind of analysis. This is just 9 particular projects from one of the participant groups, and we were able to score them against those ACM competencies and against the Excel benchmarks. And obviously there's differences, but we're seeing really quite significant skills building, even from that no code, low code starting point. The outcomes are just this plethora of research projects. I have hundreds of these, but I was trying to be disciplined and not making them too small. But we have students who are doing projects on missing children, sex trafficking in the Pacific, health inequity, COVID. They're using techniques, everything from correlation analysis to sentiment analysis. We have some students who are delving into AI and machine learning. And we have some students who just run headlong into tremendous challenges because the data to answer the questions they're interested in just don't exist in the Pacific. And some of them comment that, this has been a pathway of chaos through their research program. And we honor their contribution because they are finding out the hard way just how difficult it is to do data science in an area that's underserved by data, such as the Pacific region. What have we learned? We continue to believe that the family, the Ohana-based approach is central to inclusion of these students. We've noticed that student projects are forming meaningful, sustained connections to data partners and agencies, even when this project is just at the most embryonic level. We feel and continue to feel that operating in our time zones on our terms is absolutely critical, and that this program is not simply duplicative or redundant with efforts that are out there on the US mainland. Our next steps are about credentialing. Chaminade University recently announced that we are to be the 22nd global United Nations CFAL Center, which is a UN center for training and education. We are going to be CFAL Honolulu, serving the Pacific region, and we intend to credential these experiences using a United Nations framework. And we're very interested in developing in-place faculty research mentors in the community colleges, in the four-year institutions out there in the Pacific Islands, because there's some really interesting work going on. And we're quite interested in the idea of upskilling faculty for data science as well as their students. One of the things that, one of the challenges I think we're facing is that, by some definitions, student research success is limited by the data gaps, the data aggregation, and the data suppression that are systemic in the Pacific. Recently, last week, actually, I was on a call with some colleagues from the mainland, and a colleague from an R1 institution on the West Coast was frankly a little snotty about the research that she was seeing our students do. And I think without an understanding that almost every one of these students has run into a data gap, the data just don't exist for the Pacific. Data aggregation, where Pacific Islanders are just lumped in with a bunch of other people and not disaggregated in terms of their outcomes, health, and so on. And data suppression, I encourage everybody to review the work of this guy, Harrison Quick, who has really been a leader in explaining why a lot of small populations, small counties on the US mainland, but particularly Pacific Islanders, just aren't even counted in even major databases like WHO, CDC, because of a policy of data suppression where very small numbers of persons are made invisible in order to protect confidentiality. So that's something that we are fighting, and definitely, there is a huge movement in the Pacific. Many agencies are now addressing data gaps. WHO, the Secretariat for the Pacific Community. In Hawaii, we've seen this data justice report from the Hawaii Appleseed Center about aggregation. And then we are trying at Chaminade to be a voice around the impacts of data suppression on statistical grounds and how that affects small populations in the Pacific. These are all of the grants that support us. We have endless gratitude to the reviewers and the program officers that have decided that we were worth the risk. There's a huge team of people who are responsible for all of the hard work that I presented today. And before we have a discussion, my challenge to anyone who watches this presentation, think of us. Can we partner? Do you have faculty who have a research project or data set that is interesting to our students? Can you help us form graduate pathways? And how can you be one of a Pacific change agent, even if you're very far distant from us geographically? So I'll thank you for that, and I will we'll open the discussion.
Well, thank you, Dr. Helen. Sadly, we only have 6 minutes left in today's session. So of course, anybody is open to open up their mic and start the discussion.
Yeah, and I always run long. They know this. All the people who are on the team who work with me, I just get so excited about stuff. But also, I'm going to be on the Hoover discussion as well, and so we can do some things by chat too.
So if anybody has a question or wants, all right, we have a question from Johnny. How can we access the recording after the call? Okay, so this recording will be made available on Wednesday through the Hoover app. So you can go onto the Hoover app into the sessions, and you click on today's session, and the recording should be there.
Yeah. And Murata, did you have any comments on our, want to add anything?
Helen, thank you so much for that incredibly comprehensive, but also the compassion in your presentation as well, right? For our Pacific. I mean, I'm blown away that you know, when we talk about science anything, we don't usually start off with colonialism, right? It's the word that never really comes into the picture. But in terms of science within the Pacific, it has been about, it has been a very colonial endeavor, right? Where we have been studied, we have been measured, we have been, we've been photographed, right? And so we've become the property of other people's data sets, right? And I think that, there's a Maori scientist who talks about sciences within the academy, right, as being one of the most hostile environments for Pacific Islanders. And I think that what you have presented is a way forward, and it's a platform, it's a launch pad into a new way of doing science within the Pacific with Indigenous people, as you said, Helen, putting science in the hands of Pacific Islanders and empowering Pacific Islanders to use, for instance, in this case, data science to enhance our lives, right? And to move forward in a way that is, fully ourselves. And I think that, I won't go on long. I just want to say that, we have to be so mindful of, these endeavors as being rooted already and always within the context of colonialism, especially when you're talking about the Pacific, and how, this is in terms of us being change agents. That is no joke, right? Because there is much that needs to be changed. The canoe has to be completely hulied, right? Or turned over so that we can fully begin again in a different way, right? And using science in a way that empowers us as a region. So thank you so much, Helen, and thank you to all my colleagues here. It's such an honor to be sitting here with you all today.
I think Rylan has his hand raised. Rylan?
Well, first off, thank you, Dr. Helen Turner, for a wonderful presentation and really shining a light and also highlighting, our cooperations and actually the Ohana feel of what the Pacific is coming together as. My question would be, what are the plans for the Alliance?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Good question. So we're intending to platform this whole effort to an Includes Alliance. We had an Includes DDLP that funded it. We submitted an Includes Alliance proposal in 2019, which is very positively reviewed. It's a partnership with us, Texas Advanced Computing Center, University of Hawaii, and all these Pacific institutions. And we are going to, frame for the NSF the Pacific possibilities for data science in an alliance proposal. I think that is a looming deadline in the early spring. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I think it's fascinating also that most of the people on this call are obviously from our team, but I'm hopeful that we can disseminate this recording widely through our own channels as well going forward.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Helen, and thank you for everybody that came into today's session. Just a reminder, it will be made available next Wednesday through the Hoover app. And unfortunately, we ran out of time, but you can contact Dr. Helen via the Hoover app. You can send her a private message, and you can also continue this through the chat or the discussion panel. So once again, thank you, everybody. Please submit the survey.
Thanks, Paula. Thanks, Christy. It's been wonderful. Bye, everyone. See you soon.
Thank you, Dr. Helen.
Bye.
Bye.